How dare you? The billionaire stormed into his ex-wife's house. But when he saw her feeding newborn twins, his heart shattered, and what he did next no one could imagine. Sean didn't plan what he was going to say. He just stood there, staring at the door, his hands still raised from knocking, his heart beating in a way it hadn't in years. Not from stress, not from pressure, but from something unfamiliar, fear. The house was smaller than he expected, a simple place, no gates, no security, no signs of the life he once shared with her. Just a quiet door and a quiet street. For a moment he considered leaving, turning around, getting back in the car, telling himself he was mistaken, that the friend must have been wrong, that this wasn't real. But then he heard it, a soft sound from inside, not voices, not music, a gentle, fragile noise, a baby's cry. Sean's chest tightened. He knocked again, harder this time. The door opened, and suddenly, every meeting, every deal, every achievement in his life felt irrelevant. The air inside the house felt different from the world Sean had come from. Not cold, not heavy, just still. The kind of stillness that exists in places where people are careful not to wake someone sleeping. The living room was dim, lit by a small lamp near the corner. The light didn't shine harshly. It rested gently on the walls, on the couch, on a small table cluttered with baby bottles and folded cloths. A soft melody played from a speaker on the shelf. Not loud enough to draw attention to itself, just enough to exist in the background, slow and tender, like someone humming to keep a child calm. The room smelled faintly of warm milk and clean fabric. Nothing about the place looked impressive, but everything about it felt real. This wasn't a house built to impress guests. It was built around two tiny lives. Sean took a step forward without thinking. All the words he had rehearsed on the drive here suddenly rushed back into his throat at once. Anger, confusion, questions he didn't know how to ask without sounding afraid. His voice came out sharper than he meant it to. What gives you the right? He stopped, not because he finished the sentence, but because he finally saw her. Zora stood near the couch, her hair pulled back loosely, her face pale with exhaustion. She looked thinner than he remembered, smaller somehow, like life had been asking more from her than she had to give. Sean forgot the rest of what he wanted to say. The confrontation died in his mouth before it could be born. Zora was holding one baby against her chest. The other lay beside her on the couch, wrapped in a soft blanket, rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The baby in her arms was awake, small fingers curled around the fabric of her shirt, eyes half open but searching, as if trying to understand the world one shape at a time. Zora moved gently, rocking without realizing she was doing it. Her body remembered the rhythm even when her mind looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes, not the kind caused by sadness alone, but by nights spent awake, feeding, soothing, waiting for tiny cries to stop. She didn't look surprised to see Sean, just still, as if part of her had always known this moment would come. One of the babies shifted slightly. A small sound escaped their lips, not quite a cry, not quite a sigh, just a soft noise, like a question. Without looking away from Zora, Sean felt something brush against his hand. He looked down. Tiny fingers had wrapped themselves around one of his. The grip was weak, barely there, but it was real, warm, instinctive. Sean didn't move. He was afraid that if he did, the moment would disappear, that the child would let go, that this fragile connection would vanish before he understood what it meant. The baby held on anyway, as if they already knew him. Sean's breath stopped without his permission, not because he chose to hold it, because his body forgot how to continue. His legs felt unsteady, like they were no longer sure what they were meant to support. He shifted his weight slightly, afraid that if he didn't, he might actually fall. His throat tightened, the kind of tightness that comes before tears, not words. He had stood in front of crowds before, faced risks that could destroy entire companies, made decisions that affected thousands of people. None of that felt as heavy as this. His hand trembled inside the baby's grip, and for the first time in his adult life, Sean felt truly small. No one spoke, not Sean, not Zora, not even the babies. The room seemed to hold its breath with him. The soft melody kept playing, but Sean barely heard it anymore. His focus had narrowed to a single point, the tiny hand around his finger, and the woman standing in front of him with a life he didn't know existed. Time felt different, not slow, not fast, just suspended, as if the world had paused out of respect for what he was about to understand. This wasn't a confrontation, it was a moment of truth, and he wasn't ready for it. Sean had spent the last year convincing himself that the divorce was just another chapter he had closed, something unfortunate but necessary, something he had handled like everything else in his life, quickly, quietly, and without looking back too often. He told himself that moving on meant staying busy, that progress meant not lingering, that silence meant peace. But standing in that small living room, with a child holding his finger and a woman he once loved watching him with tired eyes, all of those beliefs collapsed at once. Because this moment didn't come from nowhere. It was built, slowly, quietly, from 1,000 choices he had made when he thought they didn't matter. And to understand why he was here now, he would have to go back to the very beginning. He used to think regret was something dramatic, something loud, something that came with shouting, tears, and broken objects. But this felt different. This felt quiet. This felt like realizing too late that the most important moment of your life had been happening while you were looking somewhere else. Have you ever walked away from something you thought would always be there? Have you ever believed you had more time, only to discover time had already made a decision for you? Sean had built everything he thought mattered, and somehow lost the one thing that actually did. What he was about to learn would change the way he saw his past, and the way he chose his future. If stories about love, regret, and second chances speak to you, take a moment to show your support. Tap the like button so this story can reach more people who might need it. Share it with someone who believes in growth, forgiveness, and learning to show up before it's too late. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Cooper's Stories for more emotional, meaningful narratives like this one. Your support keeps these stories alive. The cafe was nearly empty that afternoon. Rain tapped gently against the windows, not loud enough to be annoying, just enough to soften the world outside. The kind of rain that made people walk slower, speak quieter, and stay indoors a little longer than planned. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and baked bread. A few tables were occupied by strangers who weren't really paying attention to each other. A man reading, a couple sharing a pastry, a woman writing in a notebook near the window. That woman was Zora. She sat alone, her notebook open in front of her, pen resting between her fingers, eyes focused but relaxed. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't checking the time. She looked like someone who had nowhere else she needed to be. Sean entered the cafe without noticing any of this. He came in talking on his phone, voice firm, walking faster than the room seemed to allow. His attention was somewhere else entirely, in numbers, schedules, decisions that felt urgent but suddenly didn't belong in a place like this. Two worlds were about to meet, and neither of them knew it yet. Sean reached the counter just as the barista turned away. Still mid-conversation on his phone, he shifted his weight to one side, stepped back without looking, and collided with someone standing behind him. The cup tilted, coffee spilled, not on the floor, on the notebook. Zora gasped softly as the liquid spread across the page, dark ink blurring the words she had just written. Sean froze, finally pulling the phone away from his ear. "I'm so sorry," he said quickly, his voice losing its edge for the first time that day. Zora stared at the soaked paper for a second. Then she sighed and laughed. "Well," she said calmly, lifting the notebook, "at least now I don't have to pretend I was being productive." Sean blinked. That wasn't the reaction he expected at all. Zora didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for an apology again. She simply reached for a napkin, then another, pressing them gently against the page as if the words might return if she was patient enough. Sean stood there awkwardly, still holding his phone, unsure whether to offer help or get out of her way. "It's okay," she said, noticing his hesitation. "It was just notes for a class I'm already behind," and there was no blame in her tone, no irritation, just acceptance. Sean slowly put his phone in his pocket. It was the first time in weeks he had done that without checking one last message. Sean sat down across from her without asking, not because he felt entitled, because it felt natural. Zora looked up from the notebook and smiled slightly, as if she had expected him to stay. Apologies, small jokes, comments about the weather. But the conversation didn't stop there. It moved easily, drifting from where they grew up, to what they studied, to the things they wished they were brave enough to try. Sean found himself listening more than he spoke. Zora spoke slowly, choosing her words with care, as if each one mattered. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't feel the urge to rush her. At some point, Sean realized his phone hadn't moved. It was still on the table, screen dark, untouched, no checking, no scrolling, no quick replies under the table. Minutes passed, then more. He didn't know how long they had been talking, only that time felt softer around her, less demanding, less sharp. When the phone finally buzzed with a new notification, he glanced at it once, then turned it face down. Zora noticed. She didn't say anything, but her smile grew warmer. Their conversation didn't have a destination. It wasn't about achievements or plans that needed to make sense. They talked about childhood and memories that felt small but stayed important, about fears they rarely admitted out loud, about dreams that didn't have clear steps or timelines. Sean laughed more than he expected to, not the polite kind, the kind that surprised even him. Zora listened the same way she spoke, fully, no interruptions. No checking the time, no glances around the room. When Sean finally noticed the cafe growing quieter, he realized most of the customers had left. 3 hours had passed, and neither of them had noticed. After that afternoon, seeing each other felt natural, not planned weeks in advance, not carefully scheduled, just small messages, simple invitations, walks that started with no clear direction and ended somewhere unfamiliar but comfortable. They met for coffee again, then dinner, then late-night snacks at places that stayed open too long for people who didn't want to go home yet. Sean found himself looking forward to these moments more than anything else in his week. Zora never asked about his work in detail. She asked how he felt, and somehow that mattered more. Some nights they didn't go anywhere special. They just walked, through quiet streets, past closed shops, under streetlights that made the city feel slower and smaller. They talked about nothing important, favorite foods, songs they liked but never admitted, moments from their past that still made them laugh. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. They walked in comfortable silence, close enough for their shoulders to touch, close enough to feel each other's presence without needing to explain it. Sean realized he hadn't felt this relaxed with anyone in years, not even with himself. Some nights, they didn't go anywhere special. They just walked, through quiet streets, past closed shops, under streetlights that made the city feel slower and smaller. They talked about nothing important, favorite foods, songs they liked but never admitted, moments from their past that still made them laugh. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. They walked in comfortable silence, close enough for their shoulders to touch, close enough to feel each other's presence without needing to explain it. Sean realized he hadn't felt this relaxed with anyone in years, not even with himself. Over time, they started collecting small jokes that belonged only to them. Words said the wrong way once, then repeated on purpose. Simple moments turned into shared humor. Looks exchanged across a room that meant something no one else could understand. Zora would raise an eyebrow at him when he took things too seriously. Sean would pretend to sigh dramatically when she teased him about his important voice. They didn't need big events to feel close. Their connection lived in the smallest details, in smiles that arrived before laughter, in comments that made sense only because they had a history together. It felt like building a language no one else spoke. With Zora, Sean didn't feel like he had to perform. He didn't need to impress, didn't need to prove anything, didn't need to pretend he was always certain. He could admit when he was tired, when he was unsure. Zora never tried to fix him. She just listened. And in that quiet acceptance, Sean felt something rare, the freedom to be imperfect without feeling weak. For the first time in a long time, he felt understood without being analyzed. The proposal didn't happen in a crowded place. There were no strangers watching, no music playing in the background, no one recording on a phone. They stood on the balcony of their small apartment, city lights stretching out below them like a quiet sea of gold. Zora leaned against the railing, talking about nothing in particular. Sean watched her speak, the way her hands moved when she got excited, the way she paused to think before finishing a sentence. He didn't kneel. He didn't give a speech. He just said, softly, "Life feels lighter when you're around. I don't want to live it without you." Zora turned toward him. Her eyes filled before he even finished the sentence. Zora didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for time, didn't ask for details, didn't ask what came next. She simply nodded, tears already sliding down her cheeks, and whispered, "Yes." Not loud, not dramatic, just certain. Sean let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. They stood there for a moment, holding each other while the city continued below them, unaware that something permanent had just begun. No announcements, no celebration. Just two people choosing each other quietly. The early years felt gentle. Mornings started with shared coffee and slow conversations. Evenings ended with them sitting close, talking about anything and everything. They learned each other's habits, who woke up first, who forgot where they placed their keys, who needed silence after a long day. There were no grand moments to post or announce, just routines that felt meaningful because they were shared. Sean believed this feeling would last forever, not because he thought it was perfect, but because it felt real. Sean's days started getting longer, not suddenly, not in a dramatic way, just slowly, almost politely. One meeting turned into two turned into 4. Calls began to fill the spaces that used to belong to quiet mornings and shared breakfasts. The company was growing. Investors were paying attention. His name started appearing in places it hadn't before. Zora listened when he talked about it. She smiled when he celebrated small wins. But Sean began to notice that even when he was home, his mind stayed somewhere else. Half inside conversations that hadn't happened yet, half inside plans that never seemed finished. Success didn't arrive loudly. It settled in quietly, and it didn't leave much room for anything else. Zora adjusted her schedule to match his. At first, it felt simple. Dinner a little later, movies paused halfway through, bedtimes that shifted depending on his calls. She told herself it was temporary, that this busy season would pass. Some nights she sat on the couch with a book she wasn't really reading, listening for the sound of his key in the door. Other nights she reheated meals alone, saving his portion for when he eventually arrived. She never complained. But the silence in the apartment started lasting longer than it used to. Dinner became quieter, not because they were angry, because they were tired. Zora would talk about her day, small moments, conversations with coworkers, things she found funny or strange. Sean listened while scrolling through messages, nodding at the right times without really absorbing the details. Sometimes she stopped mid-sentence, not to test him, just to see if he noticed. Most of the time he didn't. The table stayed full. But the space between them felt larger than before. Zora started noticing his phone before she noticed his face. It was always in his hand, on the table, beside the bed, glowing softly in dark rooms. She learned to wait for the moment when his screen went black before speaking. Even then, his eyes often drifted back to it. Not because he didn't care, because he was afraid to fall behind. One evening, she reached across the table and gently turned his phone face down. He looked up, surprised. Their eyes met, and for a second it felt like the old days again. They still talked about traveling. The places stayed the same. The timing kept changing. Zora would mention dates. Sean would say, after this quarter, that quarter turned into another. Then another. Tickets were never booked. Bags were never packed. One summer, Zora took time off anyway, hoping he might surprise her. He didn't. She spent the week at home, watching travel videos alone, telling herself that plans didn't matter as much as people. But even that thought started to feel thin. Zora became quieter without realizing it. Not cold, not distant on purpose, just careful. She stopped sharing every detail of her day, stopped waiting up as often, stopped asking when he'd be home. Not because she didn't want him there, because she was tired of being disappointed. Sean noticed the change, but misread it. He thought she was adjusting. He didn't realize she was protecting herself. One night, they sat on opposite ends of the couch. The television played something neither of them was watching. "I miss you," she said quietly, not accusing, not dramatic, just honest. Sean didn't look away from his screen. "I'm right here," he replied. Zora shook her head slightly. "That's not what I mean." He sighed, finally turning toward her. "I'm doing all this for us." She nodded, but her voice lowered. "I wish you'd do some of it with me." Sean believed what he said. That was the problem. He saw long hours as proof of commitment, sacrifice as love, absence as something that would be rewarded later. He imagined a future where things slowed down, where they laughed about these years, where all this effort finally made sense. So when Zora went quiet after his words, he assumed she understood. He thought agreement looked like silence. He didn't realize it looked exactly like giving up. Zora didn't raise her voice. She didn't repeat herself. She simply looked at him for a moment longer than usual, as if waiting for something to arrive that never did. "I'm tired," she said softly. Sean nodded, already turning back to his phone. "Me too." But they weren't tired in the same way. Zora was tired of feeling alone while sitting next to someone. Sean was tired of running without realizing what he was leaving behind. Her whisper faded into the room, and he never truly heard it. The distance between them didn't arrive with noise. It arrived with routine, with mornings that started separately, with nights that ended on opposite sides of the bed, with conversations that stayed polite but shallow. They still loved each other. That was the cruel part. But love without attention started to feel like memory instead of presence. Sean thought they were surviving a phase. Zora knew they were slowly becoming strangers. The apartment felt larger than it used to. Not because anything had changed, but because neither of them knew where to sit anymore. Sean took one end of the couch. Zora sat on the other, leaving a space between them that no one had asked for, but both seemed to respect. The television was on, volume low, showing a scene neither of them could remember later. No one reached for the remote. No one suggested turning it off. They sat there side by side, sharing the same room but not the same moment. The silence wasn't awkward. It was tired. Zora spoke without turning her head. "I feel like I'm married to someone who's always leaving." Her voice didn't shake. It wasn't angry. It sounded more like a thought she had finally decided to say out loud. Sean's shoulders stiffened. He stared at the wall across from them, searching for a response that didn't make things worse. But none came, because part of him already knew she was right. Sean exhaled slowly. "I feel like I'm never enough for you." The word surprised even him. They had been sitting in his chest for months, waiting for a moment to escape. Not with anger, with sadness. "That's not what I said," she replied gently. But Sean had already said too much, and not enough at the same time. Nothing followed. No argument, no raised voices, no sudden movement. Just a long stretch of quiet where both of them stared at different corners of the room, thinking about the same thing but unable to say it. The space between them felt heavier than any words could have. Sean opened his mouth once, then closed it again. Zora folded her hands in her lap, breathing slowly, as if trying to stay calm in the middle of something breaking. They both understood what this silence meant. Neither of them wanted to be the one to name it. Zora stood up first, just with the quiet certainty of someone who had already made the decision. She walked into the bedroom and opened the closet. Sean stayed on the couch, listening to the soft sounds of hangers sliding, drawers opening, fabric being folded. Every noise felt final. She packed only what she needed: clothes, a few books, personal things that fit into 2 small suitcases. Nothing sentimental, nothing that required explanation. When she came back into the living room, Sean was still sitting in the same place. Neither of them looked at each other. The paperwork arrived 2 weeks later. No letters, no long messages, just documents in plain envelopes. They met at a small office to sign. A stranger explained the process with a calm voice that didn't match how heavy everything felt. Zora signed first. Sean followed. Their hands didn't touch. There were no tears, just the sound of pens moving across paper, ending something that once felt endless. The apartment stayed quiet after she left. Too quiet. Sean noticed things he never had before: the echo of his footsteps, the way the fridge hummed at night, the empty space on the other side of the bed. He stopped cooking, stopped watching shows. Even music felt unnecessary. He filled his time with work again, but this time it didn't feel like progress, and it didn't work. Zora didn't tell many people she was leaving. She packed her car early in the morning, before the streets filled with traffic, before anyone could ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. The city faded behind her slowly, not with relief, not with anger, just with acceptance. She didn't know exactly where she was going, only that staying meant hoping for something that no longer existed, and hoping it started to hurt more than leaving. So she drove, toward a life that didn't include him. At first, Zora thought it was just stress. She woke up feeling tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. Food tasted different. Coffee made her uneasy. The mornings felt heavier than they should have. She told herself it was the move, the new job, the quiet house she wasn't used to yet. But the nausea kept returning, not violently, not dramatically, just enough to make her pause in the middle of simple things: brushing her teeth, tying her shoes, standing too long in the kitchen. One morning she had to sit down on the bathroom floor, waiting for the room to stop turning. That was when the thought finally arrived. Not fear, not panic, just a quiet question she hadn't allowed herself to ask yet. Zora stood in the pharmacy aisle longer than she needed to. She pretended to compare labels, pretending she wasn't nervous, pretending her hands weren't slightly shaking. When she finally paid, she avoided the cashier's eyes. At home, she placed the small box on the sink and stared at it like it might speak first. The bathroom felt too quiet. She followed the instructions carefully, slower than necessary, as if delaying the result could delay the reality. Then she waited, not pacing, not crying, just sitting on the edge of the tub, hands folded in her lap. When she looked down again, the answer was already there, clear, undeniable. Her breath left her all at once. The doctor's office was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that made every sound feel louder than it should. Zora lay back on the chair, watching the ceiling while the screen beside her flickered with shapes she didn't yet understand. The doctor smiled gently. "Well," she said, adjusting the monitor, "there are two—" Zora turned her head. 2 small forms moved on the screen, side by side, separate but connected in ways she didn't have words for yet. Twins. The word echoed in her mind without settling. She laughed once, softly, then covered her mouth, not because it was funny, because it was too much to hold at once. Zora didn't cry at the clinic. She scheduled the next appointment like someone following simple instructions. It wasn't until she reached her car that her hands started shaking. She sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine, staring straight ahead as the meaning finally caught up with her. 2 lives, not one. 2 futures depending entirely on her. Her chest tightened. Tears came suddenly, not gently, falling onto her hands as she tried to breathe through the weight of it. She wasn't scared of being a mother. She was scared of being alone while becoming one. That night, Zora held her phone longer than usual. She didn't unlock it, didn't scroll, didn't type. She just stared at the screen, knowing exactly which name would appear first if she searched. Sean. Her thumb hovered near the call button. She imagined his voice, his surprise, the long silence that would follow. Part of her wanted to hear him say her name again. Another part remembered the last time he said he didn't have time for the life she wanted. The phone felt heavier in her hand. She placed it face down on the table and let the moment pass. Zora lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. Her mind kept returning to the same memory, replaying it without mercy. Sean's voice, calm and distant. "I don't have time for this kind of life." At the time, she had nodded, not because she agreed, because she didn't have the energy to argue anymore. Now the words sounded different, not like frustration, like a warning she had chosen to ignore. She placed a hand gently on her stomach, feeling the quiet presence of two lives she hadn't planned for, and she knew, with painful clarity, that calling him wouldn't change what he had already told her. The decision didn't come all at once. It arrived slowly, over days of quiet thinking and restless nights. Zora started looking at her surroundings differently. The familiar streets felt heavy. The memories felt too close. Every place reminded her of a version of herself that no longer existed. She needed space, not to escape responsibility, but to breathe without waiting for someone who might never arrive. One morning she wrote a short resignation email. No explanation, no dramatic reason, just a polite goodbye and a promise to herself that this next chapter would be hers alone. The house was small, but it felt honest. One bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a living room that caught the afternoon light through a single wide window. Zora chose it because it didn't remind her of anything. No shared memories. She unpacked slowly, arranging things the way she liked them, not the way she used to compromise. Each box emptied felt like a quiet step forward. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but it was a life she could manage. Zora chose a job that didn't ask questions. No long interviews, no interest in her past, no curiosity about why she had moved. She arrived early, left on time, and kept conversations light. Coworkers talked about weekend plans, television shows, everyday problems that felt far away from the life she had just left behind. For the first time in months, no one expected her to explain herself. She could exist without being remembered, and that felt strangely comforting. Zora prepared quietly. She read books late at night, underlining pages that talked about things she hadn't considered before. Feeding schedules, sleep patterns, how to hold a baby without fear. She attended appointments by herself, sitting in waiting rooms filled with couples and families, pretending not to notice the empty chair beside her. At home, she practiced setting up the small crib, adjusting blankets until they felt right, even though the babies weren't there yet. Sometimes she spoke out loud while doing it, not to anyone, just to fill the silence. She wasn't trying to be brave, she was trying to be ready. The nights were the hardest. The house felt larger after dark, every sound echoing longer than it should. Zora lay in bed with one hand resting on her stomach, staring at the ceiling while thoughts moved faster than sleep. Some nights she cried without making a sound, not because she regretted the babies, not because she wished things were different, but because she was tired, tired of being strong in public, tired of pretending she wasn't scared, tired of carrying everything alone. She wiped her tears before morning came. No one ever saw them. Sometimes Zora spoke to them, not in full conversations, not with cheerful voices, just soft sentences whispered in the quiet. "I'm trying my best. I don't know everything yet, but I promise I'll show up." She said their words while washing dishes, while folding tiny clothes, while resting on the couch with her eyes closed after long days. There was comfort in saying things out loud, even if no one answered. It made the responsibility feel shared, even if only in her heart. And slowly, the fear began to make room for something else. Not confidence, but connection. Zora stopped waiting for certainty. She stopped expecting to feel fully prepared. Instead, she focused on what she could control, showing up to appointments, saving small amounts of money, creating routines that felt stable even when her thoughts weren't. Fear didn't disappear. It just learned to exist beside determination. Some days were heavy, some days felt lighter, most days were somewhere in between. But every time she felt the babies move, every time she imagined their faces, she knew one thing for sure. She might be afraid, but she wasn't running. Sean wasn't expecting anything important from the conversation. It was just a brief meeting with someone he hadn't seen in a while, the kind of catch-up that stayed on safe topics, work, mutual acquaintances, things that didn't require emotional effort. They talked about the past casually, who had moved, who had changed jobs, who had disappeared from social circles. Then the friend mentioned Zora, not dramatically, not carefully, just as a passing detail. "I ran into her the other day," they said, "at a clinic." Sean nodded without thinking. Then the friend added, "She had 2 babies with her." Sean stopped breathing for a second. 2. The word didn't fit into anything he understood yet. It just stayed there, heavy and unfinished, waiting for him to ask the question he was suddenly afraid to hear. Sean laughed once, quietly, not because it was funny, because his mind refused to accept it. 2? he repeated, slower this time. The word landed harder than the first. Twins. Sean's chest tightened. His hands rested flat on the table, fingers pressing into the surface as if he needed something solid to hold on to. She looked tired, the friend continued. But happy. Sean didn't hear the rest. All he could see was Zora's face in his mind, layered with two small shapes he couldn't fully imagine yet. And suddenly, nothing in the room felt stable anymore. Sean excused himself from the table without explaining why. He walked outside, letting the door close behind him, as if fresh air might make the words easier to process. It didn't. The street looked normal. Cars passed. People talked. Life moved forward without any awareness of what had just changed for him. He leaned against the wall, staring at nothing. 2 babies, not one. 2 lives that had existed for an entire year without him knowing. His phone felt suddenly heavy in his pocket, not with messages, with absence, with everything he hadn't been part of. And for the first time since the divorce, Sean felt something sharper than regret. He felt replaced by time. Sean closed his eyes and tried to picture her. Not the version from memory. Confident, relaxed, laughing easily. But the version his friend had just described. Tired, holding 2 small bodies, standing in a place meant for care and patience. He imagined her waking up in the middle of the night, feeding them alone, learning things the hard way because no one was there to help. The image didn't feel real. It felt like a life that belonged to someone else, yet it carried his name in ways he couldn't escape. For the first time, Sean understood that Zora hadn't just moved on. She had built something new without him. Sean sat in his car for a long time without starting the engine. The city around him kept moving, but he stayed still, hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on nothing. He tried to think logically, to organize the situation, to ask practical questions, to make a plan. But his thoughts refused to line up. All he could feel was a slow, spreading weight in his chest. Not sharp, not explosive, just heavy. He thought about birthdays he had missed without knowing they existed. First words he would never hear. First steps that had already happened somewhere far from him. His throat tightened, not with tears, with the realization that time had done something he couldn't fix. It had moved on without his permission. Sean unlocked his phone. Zora's number was still there. He hadn't deleted it, hadn't blocked it, hadn't needed to. It had simply become part of a past he thought was closed. His thumb hovered over the screen. He imagined what a call would sound like now. Her voice, cautious. His questions, clumsy. Silence filling the spaces where answers should be. What would he even say? I just found out I'm a father. I didn't know. I'm sorry. None of it felt like enough. He locked the phone again. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew a call wouldn't change what had already happened. It wouldn't give him back the year he had lost. And suddenly, calling felt like the smallest thing he could do. Sean started the engine without really noticing the sound. His body moved before his mind caught up. He didn't enter an address, didn't check directions. He just drove, hands steady on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead, heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with speed. The streets blurred past, familiar but suddenly meaningless. Offices, cafes, buildings he had visited 1,000 times. None of it felt connected to what mattered anymore. For once, he wasn't chasing success. He was chasing something he didn't even know how to face yet. And for the first time in years, he wasn't late for work. He was late for life. The radio stayed off. Sean usually filled every drive with noise, news, calls, reminders of things he needed to handle next. This time he let the silence remain. The road stretched ahead of him, long and ordinary, but his thoughts refused to stay organized. They jumped between past and present, between memories of Zora laughing and the image of 2 children he had never held. Every traffic light felt slower than it should. Every stop sign felt unnecessary. He didn't know what he would say when he arrived. He didn't know if she would even open the door. All he knew was that for the first time in his life, he wasn't driving towards something he wanted. He was driving towards something he should have never left. Sean didn't knock this time. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, half expecting someone to stop him, half expecting to be told he didn't belong there. No one did. The house greeted him with the same quiet he had felt earlier, the same careful stillness, like a place that existed around sleep schedules and soft voices. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The sound felt louder than it should have. This wasn't a grand entrance. It felt more like stepping into a life he had missed the invitation to. Sean's emotions finally caught up with his body. The questions he had been holding back since the car ride rose up all at once, crowding his chest, demanding release. He took a step forward and raised his voice without meaning to. What gives you the right? The words came out sharp, full of confusion, fear, and a kind of anger that didn't know where to land. But they didn't finish forming. They never reached their destination, because something in the room made him stop. Sean finally looked up, Zora stood near the couch, her back slightly turned, one arm supporting a small bundle against her chest. Her hair was tied back loosely, strands falling out where she hadn't had time to fix them. She didn't rush to speak. She didn't look startled. She simply turned toward him slowly, as if she had been expecting this moment without knowing exactly when it would arrive. Her face looked different, not older, not sadder, just shaped by responsibility, the kind that settles into a person quietly, changing the way they carry themselves. For a second, Sean forgot what he had come to say. All he could see was the woman he once loved, standing in a life he didn't recognize anymore. Sean's eyes moved slowly, taking in details he hadn't noticed at first. The faint shadows under her eyes, the way her shoulders curved slightly forward, as if rest had become something optional, the careful way she shifted her weight, making sure the baby in her arms stayed comfortable. Zora looked like someone who hadn't slept deeply in a long time, not from sadness, from responsibility, from nights that didn't belong to her anymore. Sean realized he had never seen her like this before, not tired from work, not drained from stress, but worn in a quieter way, the kind that comes from always putting someone else first. Sean's gaze shifted from Zora to the couch beside her. That was when he noticed the second baby, wrapped in a soft blanket, lying perfectly still, chest rising and falling in slow rhythm, so small that the space around them seemed too large, too open. Two. Not just an idea anymore, not just a word, two actual lives, one in her arms, one sleeping beside her. Sean's mind struggled to hold the image. They weren't symbols, they weren't possibilities, they were real, and neither of them knew who he was. A soft melody drifted through the room, not from a television, not from a phone, from a small speaker on the shelf near the window. The tune was simple, slow, the kind meant to calm, not entertain. It repeated gently, never demanding attention, just existing in the background like a steady breath. Sean realized Zora had been playing it on purpose, not for herself, for them. The sound filled the space between heartbeats, smoothing the air, making the room feel fragile and protected at the same time. It wasn't dramatic. It was practical. And somehow, that made it more painful, because it meant this wasn't a special moment. This was their normal. One of the babies stirred slightly in Zora's arms. A small movement, barely enough to notice. The baby's hand shifted, fingers stretching outward without direction, just following instinct. Sean didn't pull back in time. Tiny fingers brushed against his skin, then closed. Not firmly, not deliberately, just a gentle grip around one of his fingers, warm and uncoordinated, like the baby was holding onto the nearest thing in reach. Sean froze. He looked down at their joined hands, unsure whether he was allowed to breathe. The baby's grip wasn't strong, but it felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. Because for the first time, the truth wasn't a thought. It was touching him. Sean's voice didn't come out the way he expected. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It barely existed at all. Are they mine? The words floated in the space between them, fragile and unsure, like he was afraid they might disappear if spoken too clearly. Zora looked at him for a long moment, not with surprise, not with relief, not with resentment, just with honesty. Yes, she said quietly. The answer didn't echo. It didn't need to. It landed exactly where it was meant to. Sean's body reacted before his mind did. His knees weakened, not suddenly, but in a slow, quiet way, like they had decided they were no longer responsible for holding him up. He took a small step back without meaning to, his free hand reaching for the edge of the wall for balance. The room tilted slightly, not because he was dizzy, because the weight of the moment had finally reached his muscles. Two children, his children, breathing in front of him, living a life he had never entered. His chest tightened, air catching halfway in, as if his lungs didn't know how much space they were allowed to take anymore. He wasn't crying, he wasn't speaking. He was simply standing in the middle of a truth too large for his body to hold. Zora didn't move to help him. Not because she didn't care, but because she knew this was something he had to carry on his own. She stayed where she was, one arm supporting the baby against her chest, the other resting lightly near the sleeping child on the couch. Her expression wasn't guarded. It wasn't hopeful either. It was calm in a way that came from experience, from nights spent making decisions without anyone to share them with. She watched Sean quietly, letting him have the space to understand what he was standing inside. No words rushed forward. No explanations followed. The room didn't need them. Everything that mattered had already been seen. Sean swallowed hard before speaking. His voice felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone who hadn't used it properly in a long time. "I would have been there," he said quietly. "If I had known, I would have shown up." The words sounded reasonable in his head. They felt thin the moment they left his mouth. He wasn't trying to excuse himself. He wasn't trying to argue. He was trying to reach backward in time and fix something that had already solidified into memory. His eyes moved between the two babies, then back to Zora. I didn't mean to miss this, he added. For the first time since he arrived, Sean looked less like a man with questions, and more like a man asking for permission to be forgiven. Zora adjusted her hold on the baby before answering, not as a distraction, as a reminder of what came first. Would you? She asked softly. Her voice wasn't sharp, it wasn't accusing, it was curious in a way that hurt more than anger ever could. You couldn't be there when it was just me, she continued. I was standing right in front of you, and you still felt far away. Sean opened his mouth to respond, but no words arrived, because nothing he said could undo the truth in what she had just spoken. Zora didn't raise her voice. She didn't list examples. She didn't bring up old arguments. She simply said what had stayed with her the longest. I needed you, she said quietly, and you weren't there for me. The sentence was simple, no drama, no exaggeration, just a fact that had lived inside her for a long time. Sean felt it settle in his chest, not as guilt, as clarity, not because he was ashamed to meet her eyes, but because he didn't trust himself to speak without damaging something further. His thoughts moved quickly, searching for explanations that wouldn't sound like excuses. None of them felt honest, so he stayed quiet. For the first time in years, he didn't rush to defend himself. He didn't try to redirect the conversation. He allowed the truth to remain where it was, unprotected, uncomfortable, real. Sean looked at the babies again, not with fear this time. Their faces were different from each other, but both carried traces of familiarity. The curve of a brow, the shape of a mouth, small reflections of himself he hadn't earned. He watched the way one shifted in sleep, how the other relaxed against Zora's chest, unaware of the conversation unfolding around them. They didn't know about regret. They didn't know about missed time. They only knew comfort, and that comfort had existed without him. Sean realized something then. They didn't need his apologies. They needed his presence, and presence was something he had to learn, not promise. Sean felt the loss settle in fully for the first time, not as a sudden pain, as a slow understanding. He hadn't just missed events, he had missed becoming someone, the version of himself who learned how to hold a newborn, who stayed awake through long nights, who grew into fatherhood through small, difficult moments. That version of him didn't exist, because he hadn't been there to create it. No amount of money could replace that. No apology could compress time. The loss wasn't about what he didn't know, it was about who he never became. Sean lifted his head slowly, not with confidence, not with answers, just with honesty. This is on me, he said. No explanations followed, no conditions, no attempts to soften the truth. Zora watched him carefully, as if listening for the part where he might shift blame or add a defense. He didn't. I chose work. I chose distance. I told myself I was building something important, and I didn't see what I was losing. His voice stayed steady, but something inside it had changed. Not regret, responsibility. For the first time, Sean wasn't asking to be understood. He was acknowledging that he already had been, and had failed to act. The room settled into quiet again, not the uncomfortable kind, the kind that arrives after something heavy has finally been placed down. Zora didn't respond right away. She looked at the baby in her arms, adjusting the blanket slightly, making sure their face stayed warm and free. Sean waited, not anxiously, not impatiently. He waited the way someone waits after telling the truth for the first time, without knowing what comes next but no longer trying to control it. Zora finally spoke. I'm not angry, she said softly. I'm just tired of carrying things alone. Sean nodded. There was nothing left to argue, no lines to cross, no defenses to build. Only two people standing inside a reality that could no longer be changed, but could slowly be faced. Sean didn't announce his decision to anyone. There was no speech, no dramatic resignation, no attempt to explain himself. He simply walked into his office one morning and asked for the numbers. Not projections, not growth charts, not future plans. Just what he owned, just what he could let go. When his financial advisor asked if he was sure, Sean nodded without hesitation. Sell half, he said. The words felt strange in his mouth. Not risky, not exciting, relieving. For the first time in years, he wasn't making a decision to gain more. He was making one to create space. Not for profit, for time. Sean didn't try to move back into her life. He didn't ask to stay, didn't assume he had that right, didn't suggest anything permanent. He found a small apartment, 5 minutes from Zora's house. Not impressive, not luxurious, just close enough to matter. When he told her, he didn't frame it as a request. I'm not trying to change anything, he said quietly. I just don't want distance to be my excuse anymore. Zora listened without responding right away. She didn't invite him in, but she didn't tell him to leave either. And for Sean, that was enough to start. Sean began with the simplest promise he could keep. He showed up, not with grand plans, not with speeches, not with expectations, just presence. Some days he arrived with groceries. other days with nothing at all, standing at the door, asking quietly if she needed help. Sometimes Zora said yes, sometimes she said no. He accepted both without argument. He learned when to step in and when to stay silent, when to hold a baby and when to just sit on the other side of the room. There were no dramatic moments, just a man choosing, again and again, not to disappear. Sean learned quickly that showing up wasn't always emotional. Most of the time it was practical. Running out of formula, no clean bottles, forgetting simple things like bread or milk. He started keeping a list on his phone, not work tasks, not reminders, just household needs. He walked through grocery aisles slowly now, reading labels, comparing prices, choosing items based on what Zora preferred, not what was fastest. The cashier once asked if he wanted a receipt. Sean hesitated, then said yes. Not for accounting. Sean started attending appointments, not standing in the background, not checking his phone in the corner, sitting beside Zora, listening. He learned the names of things he had never needed to know before, feeding patterns, growth charts, small signs of progress that felt insignificant to anyone else. The doctor spoke mostly to Zora, out of habit. Sean didn't interrupt. He took notes instead. Sometimes Zora handed him one of the babies while answering questions, but he stayed, and over time the fear softened into focus, not on himself, on them. Sean's hands had always been steady, not gentle, steady. He was used to handling contracts, devices, things that responded to pressure and precision. Babies didn't. The first time Zora placed one in his arms, he froze, afraid of proving he didn't belong in this role. Zora showed him how to support the head, how to adjust his grip, how to read small movements without panicking. He practiced quietly, not to impress, but to learn. And slowly, the stiffness in his arms faded. What replaced it wasn't confidence, it was care. Sean forgot what real tiredness felt like. Not the kind that came from long meetings. The kind that came from waking up at irregular hours, listening for small cries, standing in dim light while warming bottles. Some nights he stayed even after Zora told him he could go home. Not because she asked, because he wanted to understand what her days had been like without him. He learned how quiet the world felt at 3 a.m, how time stretched when you waited for a baby to fall asleep again, how exhaustion didn't feel like something to complain about. It felt like proof that you were needed. Zora noticed the changes before she admitted them to herself, not in big gestures, in small patterns, the way Sean arrived without being reminded, the way he stayed even when things were difficult, the way he listened more than he spoke. She watched him from across the room while he rocked one of the babies, whispering nonsense words, trying to soothe without knowing exactly how. He didn't look confident. He looked focused, present in a way she hadn't seen in years. Zora didn't interrupt, didn't comment. She just observed quietly, holding on to the truth that mattered most. He wasn't trying to fix the past. He was learning how to exist in the present. One night, after the babies had finally fallen asleep, Zora drifted off on the couch without realizing it. Her head leaned slightly to one side, exhaustion settling into her face in a way no amount of rest ever seemed to fully erase. Sean noticed a blanket slipping from her shoulders. He adjusted it carefully, the same way he had learned to adjust everything else, slowly, quietly, without waking anyone. He stood there for a moment, looking at the 3 of them. The life he had almost missed completely. He didn't speak out loud, but his lips moved anyway. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." It wasn't a promise meant to be heard. It was one meant to be kept. The days began to develop a rhythm, not a schedule written down, not rules or agreements, just patterns that formed naturally. Sean arrived in the mornings with coffee for Zora and a quiet knock instead of a message. Sometimes he helped with feedings, sometimes he washed dishes. Sometimes he simply sat on the floor with one of the babies while Zora rested her eyes for 10 minutes. They didn't discuss roles. They didn't define anything. They just moved around each other, learning the shape of this new life without forcing it into words. It felt less like rebuilding something that broke, and more like learning how to live differently. Their conversations changed. They weren't about the past anymore, not about mistakes, not about explanations. They talked about small things, which songs seemed to calm them. Sometimes they talked about work, sometimes about nothing at all. Long silences no longer felt heavy. They felt comfortable, the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled because it isn't empty. For the first time in years, Sean felt like he was part of her daily life instead of interrupting it. Zora noticed the difference slowly, not in words, in absence. Sean no longer checked his phone every few minutes. He didn't rush through tasks. He didn't look distracted while holding the babies. He asked questions. He waited for answers. He remembered things, small things. What time the babies usually got fussy, which blanket they preferred, how Zora took her tea. He wasn't trying to impress her, and that's what made it real. One evening while cleaning up after dinner, Sean paused. Zora was rinsing bottles at the sink. "I'm scared," he said quietly, not dramatically, not looking at her. "Of what?" she asked. He took a breath. "That I'll mess this up again. That I'll lose focus. That I'll become the person I was before without noticing." Zora didn't respond immediately. She kept washing. Then said, "The difference is, you're afraid now." Sean nodded. "I wasn't before. That became their new foundation. Not promises, not vows, not big statements about the future. Honesty. When Sean felt overwhelmed, he said it. When Zora felt tired, she admitted it. They didn't hide exhaustion. They didn't pretend strength. They spoke in simple sentences. "I need help. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm trying." And for the first time, neither of them felt alone while saying it. The closeness returned gradually, not through passion, through presence, sitting beside each other on the couch, shoulders touching while watching the babies sleep. Zora resting her head briefly on his arm without comment. Sean never assumed. He waited. Every small moment felt earned, and because of that, every touch felt more meaningful than anything they had shared before. It wasn't about romance anymore. It was about trust. One night, after the house had finally settled into silence, Zora spoke. "You're different." Sean looked at her. Not defensively, not nervously, just listening. "I finally understand what I was afraid of losing," he said. He didn't hesitate. "You—" Zora stayed quiet for a moment, and in that small movement, something fragile and real began to grow again. Not the relationship they once had, but something stronger, something slower, something built on presence instead of absence. They didn't talk about marriage again, not because the idea was gone, but because it no longer needed to lead the conversation. There was no pressure to define what they were rebuilding, no timelines, no need to prove anything to anyone. They focused on what existed in front of them. 2 children who needed care, 2 adults learning how to show up differently, a life that felt fragile but honest. For the first time, Sean understood that commitment wasn't a promise about the future. Mornings became their quiet ritual. Sean arrived early, before the babies woke, bringing coffee and fresh bread from the corner store. Zora prepared bottles while he warmed the milk. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. It wasn't impressive, but it felt full. Sean realized that this was what he had always been searching for, not recognition, just belonging somewhere that didn't require him to perform. Evenings were calmer. After the babies slept, they often sat together in the living room, lights low, no television on. The silence felt different now, not like distance, like rest. Sometimes Sean rested his arm along the back, close but not demanding. They had learned that silence could be shared, that presence didn't always need words. One night, while folding laundry together, Zora spoke quietly. He didn't defend himself, didn't argue, didn't rush to reassure. "I don't want to get hurt like before. I don't want to hurt you again." The honesty sat between them, not heavy. Sean spoke slowly. "I can't promise I'll be perfect," he said, "but I can promise I won't disappear. I won't choose distance. I won't run when things feel difficult." Zora listened. Not for the words, for the truth inside them. She had learned the difference, and for the first time the truth felt steady, not exciting, not dramatic, just dependable. Later that night, as they sat together watching the soft rise and fall of the baby's breathing, Zora shifted closer. Her head rested lightly on Sean's shoulder. Not as a decision, not as a declaration, just as a moment. Sean didn't move, he didn't speak. He let the weight of it settle. It wasn't the rush of new love. It was the quiet return of something deeper, safety. Their story didn't end with a wedding. It didn't end with applause. It ended with something smaller and far more meaningful. 2 people choosing to stay, choosing to listen, choosing to move forward without pretending the past didn't exist. They didn't erase what had happened. They learned from it, and in doing so, they created something different from what they had lost. Not perfect, and this time, real was enough.